All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to BIOL 105. This is our Human Impacts Lecture Part 2. We're going to be talking primarily about population and then about affluence and their impacts on human impacts. So, population, it's part of our IPAT model. Let's have a look at what's happening. Well, you'll remember that there are two types of population growth curve that are described in our lectures on wildlife population growth. We've got on the left exponential growth, and on the right here, you've got logistic growth. And really, the key point is that one assumes there's no constraints on resources, that is exponential, whilst our logistic growth curve assumes that eventually any environment's going to run out of resources. And that is true even of planet Earth. So, what's happening with our current population? What's it looking like? Which one of these? Well, the answer is that actually population growth of humans has looked a little bit more exponential, going way back to the Paleolithic. And that has been driven by a lot of changes in our technology and resource access. So, if you jump into the Paleolithic, we have the development of fire and really the tools associated with improved access to resources. So, you get a bit of population increase, you start to see a bit of land modification. Eventually, we hit the agricultural revolution, and that's really where things get going about 10 to 13,000 years ago as we domesticate crops and livestock. And that's a massive improvement in our centralization of our societies and the availability of food that facilitates population growth. We then have the Industrial Revolution, where we switch from using fire as our energy source and animals over to actually using fossil fuels. There's so much more energy, means so much more production and improvement again in the productivity of our society and the availability of food and resources. And then finally, we hit the technological era where we have modern medicines that facilitate longer lifespans. We have improved technology, for example, food production, like the Haber-Bosch process. And so again, populations continue to increase. And really, technology changes so fast. Like, it's impressive. So the outcome of all this is going to be decreased mortality rates and actually increased fertility as well as we increase our resource use and capacity to extract things from the environment. Example of how fast things change, like these are floppy disks, which we used to have for our computers to save things and to load games. And now that's the save icon. Many people don't even know that it was once actually what you had to use to save any file you had. When I was a kid, even I used to have a BBC and use a tape recorder to load games like Elite. Amazing game, by the way, but yeah, kind of painfully slow to wait for a game to load for 20 minutes as the tape slowly turned around. So we jump back to populations. What's been happening? Well, first up, life expectancies have increased, driven by lower infant mortality and longer lifespan into adulthood. So obviously, that's going to increase your population. So that's a nice thing. And on average, it's higher in developed countries, I should point out, although that's changing. We also see infant mortality dropping. So that's declined across societies. And more recently, we've seen big declines in developing countries as well. So that's going to lead to more people capable of having more children. That's kind of cool. So that's helping and primarily driving that increased life expectancy. All right, what about our next factor? We therefore see this rapid increase in population. And so we're now zooming into the last 1,000 years. We can really see that with the advent of the Industrial Revolution and then mid-1900s, we see this exponential growth in population size. So do we think this is going to carry on into the future? Have a think about that. Like, we're now about 8 billion people. So this has increased to the present 2026. What about what's going to happen next? So what we're going to do is we're going to describe something called the demographic transition model to try and explain why population growth is going to decline in the future. So let's look at that. In 1950, there were less than a billion children. 2000, there are 2 billion. How many will there be in 2100? Well, the answer is 2 billion. So how can it be that our growth rate changes to zero such that we just maintain roughly the number we have now? So the outcome is going to be a change in our population size going forward. But by 2050, what do you reckon we're going to hit? We're currently 8 billion. Will we carry on growing? Will we stay the same? Where's growth going to come from? Well, the answer is that we're going to end up about 10 to 13 billion. 9 to 11 is another estimate, different ones thrown around, and that growth will come from some regions of Asia and primarily from sub-Saharan Africa. But it's notable that not all regions of Asia are not those where you'd necessarily expect. So, what do we think is uh, like stopping population from getting quite as high as we might have otherwise thought? So, global fertility is declining. Here's the primary reason. So, even though fewer babies are dying, when they grow up, people are having fewer children, especially in developed countries. And there's a couple of reasons that have been proposed for that. But the key point is that per woman, your average woman now is expected to be having approximately 2 children, maybe even fewer. And that means it's just replacement rate. Okay. The birth rate will be equal to death rate. And the outcome of that is potentially no more population growth. So we think, therefore, that actually populations having grown exponentially to the current point are going to start to slow down in growth because people are having fewer children. This growth rate, this fertility is declining. And so therefore, population stabilizes in a manner expected for a logistic growth curve. And we have strong evidence to support that this will happen because it already has happened in tons of countries which are relatively wealthy. And therefore, we'll end up with that 10 to 13 billion people. And indeed, current global growth rates are much lower than they used to be. So why does fertility decline? The key factors are survival of children, which impacts probability of having future children, education and literacy, and particularly education of women. So access to education decreases the number of children women have, and the status of women especially, such that the capacity to get work in their own right enables women to work, and therefore they have fewer children. These are relatively established facts. And access to contraception and family planning further reduces fertility. So we see a decline overall. And these are all correlated with development in countries and wealth. I say correlated, so always hold, but by and large. So if you look at where fertility is high, it's actually sub-Saharan Africa, which is relatively a low wealth area, and actually Afghanistan in particular in Asia, and other slightly less wealthy areas of Asia will see ongoing higher fertility rates. So we think that something about getting rich means you have fewer kids. We think it's linked to the status of women, education, and access to contraception, but also the incentives for having more children has now also been put out there, where you potentially need to invest more in those kids in order for them to survive in a highly competitive environment where wealth acquisition and skills are the primary driver. So we call this a demographic transition model. And this is, you need to understand, it's got 4 stages. And what we're going to do is track how mortality rate changes, also called death rate, how birth rate changes, and what the consequences are for population. So let's follow those along. If you imagine a pre-industrial stage where we start to see improving sanitation and food availability, at that point, mortality is going to start to decline. Okay, so that's going from a pre-industrial stage where birth rate, death rate is actually equal, and therefore population stable. Then we go to this transitional stage where the mortality declines, and therefore population goes up because we're having more people to have more children. However, after population started increasing now, we go into an industrial stage where wealth starts to mean that people reduce their birth rates. And at that point, fertility declines. And so we're still seeing a lot of locked in population growth because we've got more people who're still having quite a lot of kids. But at some point, our birth rate, our death rate get back into synchrony. And at that point, we reach our post-industrial developed stage where population growth is stable. And that reflects the current status quo in many developed countries around the world. In fact, many are even going into a negative population growth like Japan, Italy, and many other European countries. Okay. Actually, some South American countries too. So basically, development and wealth is going to reduce the population impact on the environment. Hooray! Or did it? Actually, look at this. The demographic transition involves a big jump in population size associated with getting to the future wealth point. So you kind of got to go through the population growth. That's a necessary step. Once you get to the end of it, you're at a stable new population. So maybe the environmental impact is no longer going to increase, and we won't actually exceed our carrying capacity. Maybe everything's okay. However, there's a catch. Specifically, as you increase in wealth, you start using more resources. So this is called the development paradox, where you can solve the population problem with the demographic transition, but we're left with more people consuming more resources. And so that's the affluence part of human impacts. And I'll quickly go over that now to finish up this lecture. So affluence is a correlative of wealth. That's the first thing, which is also measured by GDP. So if you look at GDP along the bottom, you can see as this increases, so does a country's consumption of oil, which is a correlate of your resource use. Unfortunately, in getting wealthy and going through the demographic transition, you end up with a population that uses many more resources. And by the way, China and India are now spectacularly much further along this GDP curve, and concurrently, they are using way more resources. So that's a bit of an issue. Affluence and consumption are an outcome of the demographic transition. So our affluence increases the consumption, and at this point in time, the concept that everyone on Earth, 8 billion people, could live this 1989 sort of American lifestyle of having their own home, access to all nice resources, tons and tons of like spare money for recreation and fun, that's kind of gone. It's maybe not possible for us to do that with our current societal model, with the number of people we have moving into this level of wealth while not exceeding Earth's carrying capacity. And that's the problem, right? If everyone lived like a Homer Simpson style lifestyle, which maybe is a sort of goal for many, then we'd actually greatly exceed our global carrying capacity. And so goes the logic. Because if you look at like the US and other developed countries, we are greatly exceeding what we call our ecological footprint. And that is basically the capacity of the environment to produce enough resources and assimilate our waste to meet our needs. So if it's in balance, like one planet would give enough resources and waste capacity for everyone on Earth. But if we all lived the way that they do in the US, we'd actually need 4 planets to meet that, and basically Canada too. I shouldn't target the US alone. So we got a problem. If we all want to live the good lifestyle, we're going to exceed Earth's carrying capacity. So really our problem is less about population and more about how we solve the resource consumption problem in affluent nations. So overall, demographic transition and population growth is going to lead to stability, but it's going to lead to more resource use as well. So do we exceed Earth's carrying capacity if we go to that future population? Let's say it's 9 to 11 billion. What do you reckon? Yes or no? If everyone on Earth has the high socioeconomic living standard. Why do you think that? I'm going to hazard yes, we will. And my reasoning is, first of all, we already exceed our carrying capacity if you take the average global levels, and that's driven by developed countries. Second, we're going to have even more people consuming even more resources in the future. Third, we're likely to actually use more resources per capita because our technology improves and our capacity to manipulate the environment increases. And then fourth, actually our natural capital is decreasing because we're presently damaging the environment and therefore reducing the availability of future resources. So try and identify these 4 reasons and explain therefore why we're likely to do more impact in the future than less. Someone might argue that C might be lower because maybe technology enables us to make ourselves a little bit less damaging in terms of our development. You could argue that. So what's the outcome? Well, we see that in 1970, we actually started exceeding the world's biocapacity, and that we've carried on increasing ever since then, if you just take the cumulative impact of humanity. You'll note biocapacity has been going up, and that's because of technology advancements that's increased the productivity we're able to extract from the environment. But we're still in overshoot. That's our major issue. And if you go into overshoot with our red line of consumption, then eventually you degrade your carrying capacity to the point where you get collapse. And that is my major worry, that we will not deal with our resource consumption problems before we actually crash. So there's that ecological footprint per country. You can see that it's much higher in developed countries. And so really that's what's driving the fact we're exceeding our ecological footprint as a globe. You can see this again if you just multiply population by affluence to work out impact. So you've got a big country of 1 billion people, 1,000 million, with GDP per capita of 1,500, and then you compare that with a smaller country of 60 million with 40,000, you can find out that the country that's using more resources and generating more waste is actually going to be your smaller country. So it's B here. 60 billion people, 60 million times 40,000 does more impact than our higher population, lower capacity, lower consumption country. You can kind of compare the two and work out that it has 1.6 times the impact. And this actually represented the UK and India back in 2000, where the UK had a bigger impact. Actually, that's reversed now because India, of course, has underseen amazing development and wealth. And as a result, now India consumes considerably more resources overall than does the UK. So what are we learning? We have an inequality in terms of resource use, with the wealthy using way more resources than the poor, both the countries, state, but also within countries, like here in New York with the homeless person and these fashionistas. And then we have wealth inequality here. This is from Brazil, but this could be from any country, really, where you have very wealthy living alongside poor. And the level of resource use by these wealthy far outstrips the higher population in the poor areas. Like, some people are insane in their consumption. This is Larry Ellison. He's the owner of Oracle, who make computer hardware, owns an enormous amount of resources, way more than many, many thousand individuals. So if you take the top 20% in terms of wealth, they consume vastly more resources than the rest of the world. And so it's really a sort of an affluence problem that we need to solve going forward. So do they use more resources, those places with high population growth? The answer, of course, is no. Places with current population growth have a high fertility rate, but they use very little resources. So maybe in the future they will, once they've gone through the demographic transition, but at this point of time, pointing the finger of blame for environmental damage at these countries which are developing is absolutely misplaced. The issue is our wealthy nations, and in particular, the wealthy individuals in the wealthy nations who are driving our resource use and the fact that we're exceeding our ecological footprint. So here's my key takeaway. This quote from George Monbiot: "To suggest population growth is largely responsible for ecological crisis is to blame the poor for the excesses of the rich." How do we get here? Demographic transition. It solves the population problem, but it gives us an affluence and resource use problem, which we need to solve. And I should point out that this is basically me. My lifestyle is to blame for many of our worst environmental impacts, and anyone else who is wealthy like myself. We are the ones who are driving primary damage at this point in time. So what do we do next? Well, the problems: we've got a large population that's still growing, and that they increasingly use too many resources. And so really we need to constrain both population and resource use. The good news is that population is going to come down because of the demographic transition. So that'll be largely controlled, and we can try and control that growth. And the next one is the affluence option. We have to reduce unsustainable resource use. That's going to be more of an intractable problem. And so let's look at our options for number 2 here. One is that we just reduce the resources we use, because we all know how much people like to do without stuff. Like, imagine not going on as many holidays, or buying fewer things, or eating less exotic foods. It's hard to do, right? So that one's a challenge. The outcome is you would reduce current resource use by rich and everyone, but everyone has to change their behavior. Option two is we just use resources in a more sustainable way. So, for example, renewable energy, circular economy, these kinds of things, which could, in theory, allow us to maintain or even increase our resource use, especially if that's facilitated by technology. But this is a little bit of a hope rather than a known, right? And then the third one is just do nothing. And so my guess is that we're really just going to do all three of these to some extent. There will be some who modify the behavior, but overall, if I were to think about what's going to happen, I'm thinking not that many people will be willing to actually take less stuff because everyone loves their things and the quality of life that's gained from that. We could, in theory, increase sustainable consumption and ideally maintain, potentially even increase resource use if we are smart. Recycling, reduction of waste production, these kinds of factors, processing our waste. This is the goal there. And then finally, doing nothing, which some might argue is going to happen in some places, maybe everywhere. Not the best option because if we don't do anything, then the outcome is super bad. We are looking at collapse, just like Easter Island. We'll crash our environmental natural capital, and then our societies will collapse. Some might be able to monopolize resources, most of us won't get access to them. And so I really hope we're able to find sustainable solutions for our resource use, even as our population starts to stabilize. So, how can we achieve that? That's what we're going to dig into in our current future lectures. So make sure you remember from this one, what were our impacts? What is the IPAT model? What does it stand for? And what factors affect population, affluence, and technology? Talk about the demographic transition and how the positive outcome is stable population, the negative outcome is increasing resource use, and really talk about who is responsible for that resource use, the development paradox of it being rich nations who are needing to modify their behavior